Welcome back to Let Love In, and I'm really excited. We've got again Dr. Margaret Paul. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Well, we're going to talk about at-will divine connection, essentials to let love in. So my question for you is, you've got a new book. Do you want to maybe show us what the book is?
Yes. It just came out, Diet for Divine Connection. And the subtitle is Beyond Junk Foods and Junk Thoughts to At-Will Spiritual Connection. And best-selling author Marcy Shimoff wrote the foreword, which is wonderful. And it's got all kinds of fantastic endorsements. So I'm very, very excited about this book.
Great.
And this book shows people what needs to happen to keep their frequency high enough in order to access their divine guidance at will. And this is very, very important for letting love in, because if we're not open to ourselves, if we're not open to love coming in through us, we don't have love to share with each other. And this is about letting that divine love into our heart, into our soul, so that we do have love to share with each other. And when we're closed off, we're always trying to get love, but we're not actually available for love if we're not in that open space. And people don't realize how many things shut them down, how many things close their heart and lower their frequency to the experience of love. And this book really lets them in on all the things that are happening in our environment, in our food, in our thoughts. That's why we focus on junk food and junk thoughts, because that actually keeps our frequency down, keeps our heart closed. And we can try all we want to be letting love in, but if our frequency is too low, it is not going to happen.
Yeah, so that's an interesting sentence. I don't know how many of us have ever thought of junk foods and junk thoughts together in the same sentence. Can you help us make some sense of how did the two connect?
So our frequency has to do basically with the food and the thought, because we are mind, body, spirit. We're not just thought, and our body has a frequency as well as our thoughts have a frequency. And unfortunately, in today's society, there's so much junk foods around. So much foods with sugar in them, and with the GM wheat. All wheat is now genetically modified, which is very, very tough on the body. There's so much food with the GMOs and with, high fructose corn syrup and all kinds of additives, and all of these things lower the frequency of the body. And the way that I discovered this was that I was not a healthy kid. By the time I was in my early 20s, I was really, really tired of being sick. So I started doing a lot of research on what creates health. And I threw everything out of my kitchen and started to eat out of the one little health food store that was there at the time. And my health dramatically improved. But over time, I moved onto a spiritual path. And I wanted to be able to connect to my higher guidance. And I had a guru, and I joined a meditation group, and I did all kinds of things to try and have this connection. But even though I was eating really well, I couldn't get the connection until Spirit brought us inner bonding. And when Spirit brought us inner bonding, I realized that our that our intention has everything to do with our frequency, with whether or not we are operating at a higher enough frequency to connect with our spiritual guidance. And so in inner bonding, there's only two intentions. There's the intention to learn about love, and there's the intention to protect against pain with all kinds of controlling behavior. Well, when I finally understood this, I started to be able to open to learning. And when I was able to choose the intention to learn, lo and behold, I started to connect with my higher guidance at will. So I thought it just had to do with intention, with my thought process. And then I started working with my clients, and helping them move into an intention to learn. But they didn't have the same easy time connecting as I did. And then I realized, oh, I have been eating this very, very clean way for many, many, many years. And I finally put it together. I connected the dots, that it's both food and thought. And I started to do research about it. And I thought, no one is talking about this. No one is talking about how much the foods we eat can raise or lower our frequency, and how much our intention raises and lowers our frequency, because our intention to love determines the kinds of thoughts we have, and our intention to control leads to the junk thoughts. So I finally got that the reason I was having an easy time with at-will divine connection was because of both the food and the thought. And that's when I thought, well, this is really fantastic. This is really important information. And that's when I decided to write this book.
Great. So you got me really curious with that sentence that you just said. Our intention to control leads to junk food. Could you see?
No, our intention control leads to junk thoughts, which leads to junk food. I mean, it's all tied in. When we're thinking junk thoughts like I'm not good enough, or I have to give myself up to control getting love, or if I get angry, then I can get somebody to love me. I mean, there's all kinds of false beliefs, which are the junk thoughts. Well, when we've learned to abandon ourselves by ignoring our feelings, judging ourselves with all these junk thoughts, turning to various addictions, numbing out, giving ourselves up, making other people responsible. These are all forms of self-abandonment. We end up feeling terrible inside. We end up feeling alone and empty inside. And so what do? When we feel alone and empty, we turn to various addictions, and food is a big one that people turn to. And it's not just food. It's drugs, it's alcohol, it's nicotine. All of these lower our frequency and make it very, very hard to connect to our higher guidance. And this is what I go into in the book, is all of these, see, it's all tied in, it's a circle. If we have these junk thoughts and we abandon ourselves, we feel really bad, we feel really empty, then we turn to various addictions. And then that will fill us for the moment, but it lowers our frequency so much, makes it impossible to access our truth, our higher guidance. And this is what's happening in this country so much now, where, you know, people are, they're dumbed out in front of the TV, and they're listening to all this stuff, and they're buying into it because they can't connect to their own source of truth because of the junk food and junk thoughts.
All right.
And then they try to get into a relationship, and what happens? They're just trying to have control over getting love. They're giving themselves up. They're losing themselves in the relationship. They wonder, you know, why are they so needy? Because they don't know how to love themselves. And then, of course, they can't share love.
Great. So that was going to be my next question to you, because I know that in past summits, I've interviewed you on self-abandonment and in inner bonding. So why is it that relationships are so difficult? And you just touched on that when we self-abandon.
Well, you see, when we self-abandon with both food and both thought, we create this sense of emptiness inside. There's no love. There's no love. See, love is everywhere. Love is spirit. Love comes in when we're open. When our frequency is high enough, love comes in. We get all filled up with it, and then we can share love with each other. But when we're abandoning ourselves, we are leaving ourselves very empty inside. And then we have to try and get love. Well, we attract at our common level of self-abandonment or our common level of self-love. So if we're abandoning ourselves, we're going to attract somebody else who's also abandoning themselves. Then nobody has any love to give. Nobody has any love to share. And so at the beginning, you know, we might feel, oh, this is great. You know, this person's loving me. I'm loving them. We're on our best behavior. But it doesn't last very long because we're basically empty. And then we try all these controlling ways to try and get love, which only cause the other person to either feel rejected or to feel controlled. And most people come into relationships with those two fears, that they're either going to lose the other person or they're going to lose themselves. And so when two people come together at their common level of woundedness, they're acting in the very ways that scare the other person. And then eventually they think, oh, I've picked the wrong person. And then they move on. But they didn't necessarily pick the wrong person. They haven't become the right person. They have to become the right person for themselves first. They have to learn how to love themselves on, actually, I have isolated 6 different levels: emotionally, physically, financially, within relationships, organizationally, and spiritually. So if people are abandoning themselves in these levels, then they're looking to somebody else to take care of them in those levels. Now sometimes that'll work out. Sometimes somebody's willing to take financial responsibility. If the other person is, maybe a highly sexual person, and they're meeting their sexual needs, and it kind of evens out. But most of the time, it doesn't work well. And especially when we make somebody responsible for our sense of safety, our sense of worth, that somebody else has to validate us or have sex with us or give us attention in order to feel worthwhile. And then we pull on that person. Well, maybe that person has a fear of engulfment and hates being controlled. Well, if you're making that other person responsible for your sense of worthwhileness, that person's going to end up feeling engulfed. They're going to pull back. And then that will probably tap into your fear of rejection. And the more that person pulls back, the more you get scared, the more you try and control, the more you try and control, the more that person feels engulfed and pulls back, and eventually that relationship doesn't work at all. So it's just essential, if we want a loving relationship, that we have to learn to love ourselves first. And that's really what this book is about. This book is about learning to love yourself on all of these levels, so that you're filled up and you can connect with your source of love and wisdom at any moment. And that's when you become able to share love with this other person.
Yeah, what I really love about what you just said is, because we attract a partner at our lowest level of self-abandonment or self-love, is that what we end up, who we become in relationship when we feel vulnerable or at risk, is that it sounds like what we do is we trigger our partner in their woundedness, and they trigger us in our woundedness. And it's a vicious cycle that we can't get out of unless we begin to do the work ourselves.
Yeah, that's right. And so, so often, let's say there's a relationship where one person's angry and the other is withdrawn, a common dynamic in relationships. So the one's angry is going to say, well, if he wasn't withdrawn, I wouldn't be angry. And then he'll say, well, if she wasn't angry, I wouldn't be withdrawn. You see? And they're both right and they're both wrong, because actually either one can shift the system. If one of them stopped their part of this dynamic, the system would shift. But they're both wrong because they both came in with these ways of protecting and controlling. They didn't just learn them in the relationship. They probably learned them in childhood. Maybe one of them had an angry parent, or one of them had a withdrawn parent. And they learned these ways of protecting and controlling way before they came into the relationship. And it's just that they're now triggering each other, but they're not causing each other to behave that way. And so when one person decides to shift their end of the system by learning to love themselves, miraculous things can happen. I work with this all the time. Sometimes both people come into a session with me, but very often only one person will come in. But as that person learns to love themselves and stops acting out their controlling end of the system, whether it's giving themselves up or getting angry or withdrawing or resisting or whatever it is, when they start learning to love themselves and they're not being reactive in the system, that's when amazing changes could happen. And usually, not always, usually the other person will say, wow, I like what's happening. I want to learn that too. Now, sometimes the relationship will get worse. Like, let's say the relationship is based on one person being very dominating and the other person being compliant, giving themselves up. That's a common system. One person is demanding and the other person is compliant. And the compliant person, it's hard to realize that that person is controlling, but they're controlling by giving themselves up. And their thought is, if I'm compliant and I do what this other person wants, they'll love me. Well, it doesn't happen to work out very well, because the demanding person just keeps demanding, the compliant person keeps being compliant until they end up feeling like they're used up and they get angry, and then the relationship falls apart. But if the compliant person starts to learn to love themselves, the demanding person might not like it. And that may lead to the end of the relationship. So I say to people, it's 50-50. When you learn to love yourself, you don't know what the outcome is. You have to be willing to have it get better or get worse, depending on the system. But it's going to change when one person changes their end of the system.
Yeah, so the system will change one way or the other, but they'll end up loving themselves in a much healthier relationship with themselves.
Oh, that's right. And so if the relationship doesn't work out, they'll have benefited anyway, because they'll be loving themselves and they won't be taking all of their learned protective, controlling behaviors with them into the next relationship. And they will likely attract a much more loving person. And this is what I've seen over and over and over again. With the people whose relationships don't work out, they end up attracting a much more loving, open to learning person into the relationship.
All right, so let's talk about, I've interviewed you a lot on inner bonding and how to heal self-abandonment. Could you speak about the steps to inner bonding?
Yeah, so step one of inner bonding is that we have to be willing to feel our pain rather than avoid it. If we're just into avoiding it, we're going to be abandoning ourselves. And so we have to be willing to feel all of our painful feelings and learn from them. They all have vital information for us. All of our feelings have vital information. They let us know whether we're abandoning ourselves, whether we're loving ourselves, whether somebody else is being loving or being unloving. So we need our feelings. And step one is the willingness to feel them, and that we want responsibility for them. And step two is we focus in our heart, we consciously open to learning, and we invite the love and the compassion of spirit into our heart. And that creates what we call the loving adult self. We're a loving adult when we're open to learning and connected with our higher source. And then in step three, we're dialoguing. Like, let's say you feel depressed. And so you open to learning, you invite your guidance in, and you say to that depressed part of you, which we might want to call an inner child, because that helps us know that we're responsible for our feelings. Our inner child is our feeling self. And so we're going to ask that part of us, what am I doing? How am I treating you? What am I telling you? And here's where the junk thoughts come in, the false beliefs. That's causing you to be depressed. So then we go in and we let that depressed part of us answer. Now let me just say, depression can come from a number of sources. It can come from unresolved child abuse or other trauma. It can come from eating badly, because when we have a toxic gut, it goes into the brain and creates toxicity in the brain. But that's also a form of self-abandonment. Or it can come from our junk thoughts. So that that inner child might say, well, you're telling me that I'm not good enough, that I'm not lovable. Well, that's likely to cause depression. If you were to tell a child over and over again, you're not good enough, you're not lovable, that child might feel very depressed. And so it's through this process of dialoguing that we start to become aware of how we're treating ourselves and what our beliefs are. So let's say you're telling yourself you're not good enough, you're not lovable enough. Well, then we would go into what we call the wounded part of ourselves, which is our ego self, that's programmed with all of these false beliefs. And we would ask this part of us, how did you get the belief that you're not good enough, that you're not lovable? And what's the point of telling ourselves this? What do you hope for by telling yourself that you're not good enough, you're not lovable enough? Well, it turns out that when we shame ourselves like that, when we tell ourselves we're not good enough, that gives us a sense of control over other people, because if we believe we're not good enough, then we can figure out how to act right, how to do it right, and then maybe we can control other people. But if other people are treating us, and let's say a partner is treating you in an unloving way, and you really know it has nothing to do with you, then you have to accept that you can't control this other person. And that's a very difficult thing for people to accept. People don't want to accept they're helpless over other people being loving or unloving, that other people are going to choose that on their own and that we don't have anything to do with it. So there's a lot of things we tell ourselves to give ourselves a sense of control over how people treat us, even though it doesn't work out at all. And even though it may cause anxiety or depression or guilt or shame or anger or aloneness or emptiness, people continue to treat themselves badly as a form of control. So once we realize we're doing this, then we go to step 4, which is we go up to our higher guidance. And here's where it's very important to be able to have at-will connection. We want to know, is it true that I'm not good enough? Is it true that I'm not lovable? And if not, what would be loving towards myself? What do I have to do so that I'm not depressed? Well, how do I need to begin to treat myself so that I'm not anxious, so that I'm not angry, so that I'm not guilty or ashamed? We need to access that information from our higher self. But if we're bogged down with junk food and junk thoughts, we don't have access to that information. And so in step 4, we open to learning with our higher guidance. We discover the truth. We discover the loving action. In step 5, we take that loving action. So let's say, you start out depressed and your guidance says the first thing you need to do is you just need to get present with yourself. Instead of ignoring yourself and judging yourself, you need to get present with yourself. Imagine you're sitting with a little child and you're holding that child. And you're starting to see who you really are, because the only way that we know who we are inside is through the eyes of our higher guidance. And we need that access in order to get who we are in our soul, in order to get that we're a spark of the divine, that we're such loving, magnificent beings inside, and that when we're treating ourselves badly, we're hurting ourselves by doing that. And so we need this access. And then we need to start to learn what it means to love ourselves. And we take that step in step 5. And then in step 6, we tune back in and we see how we're feeling. And if we're feeling some relief, then we know that we've taken a loving action. And we're starting to treat ourselves based on the truth rather than based on the false beliefs. So that's a very brief overview of inner bonding. It's quite an in-depth process. But when people learn it, they learn to love themselves, they learn to see themselves, they learn to value themselves, they learn to access that higher guidance, they learn to fill themselves up with love, to share with each other.
All right, that's great, and that's really thorough. And for people that are watching this, if they want to learn more, if they want to get access to an exercise, something from you, I know that you've put together a free gift for our viewers. Could you speak to that?
Right. Yeah, so this is a little ebook that came through from my guidance that's called Dear God, How Can I Love So That I May Heal? And this actually teaches the 6 steps of inner bonding. People can learn it through this little ebook, and that will be very, very helpful to them in terms of starting to learn the inner bonding process. And there's so many ways on our website at innerbonding.com for people to learn how to love themselves, begin to learn how to love themselves. It's a process. For me, it's a lifetime process. I love learning about it all the time. But people can get started and they will find that they feel relief right away, as soon as they start to learn to love themselves.
All right, and if you're watching this video, right below the video is a link. Make sure that you take advantage of Dr. Paul's free offer. And Dr. Margaret, if there was one thing you would hope our viewers take away from today's call, what would that be?
Okay, well, you know what? I got the title backwards. It's How Can I Heal So That I May Love? That's the ebook. And what I want people to take away is that they can heal. Everybody can heal. No matter what you went through in your childhood, no matter how damaged you feel you are, there's always a part of us inside that's never been damaged. And as you learn and practice inner bonding, you discover this beautiful, wonderful, undamaged part of you. And that's what I want people to know. You don't have to go through life suffering. You can heal. You can move into peace. You can move into joy. You can move into love. And you can create healthy relationships.
I love that. And with that, Dr. Paul, I want to say thank you so much for the time that you've given us, for the free offer you've put together, for your new book that's come out, and for the difference that you make in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iris.